Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video on card design in Photoshop. I did a video a couple days ago about how I made my template from scratch, where I made it so I could modulate the text box, make it taller or shorter depending on how much text needs to be in the text box. And basically the reasoning for that is obviously if you have not very much text, might as well, if you're making a full art card, you might as well make it shorter so that you can have more room for the art. Um, but the methodology for how I make the text box get taller or shorter, how I make it modulatable in the template, it's very different depending on how your template is structured, what it looks like, the way you've organized your layers. So I wanted to offer another perspective of how I will do this on a different template. So I've taken a template from a viewer, and I'll be modifying their template to be able to modulate like I did with the template in the previous video. And thanks to Sylvan in the Discord for letting me mess around with his template for a bit and try to make this work. I haven't done any modifications to this template yet, just looked through a bit to see kind of how they've structured their frame. The only thing I have added is this layer, which adds this gray border around the side to make it look like a normal card, because on this template they've put a 1/8 inch area around the edges for print bleed, which basically is when you're printing, in case the card gets miscut slightly, you want there to be extra color around the edges so that it's not going to look weird if it's slightly miscut. So I've just added this layer that's just the same gray color as my background here so that I can visualize the card, what it's going to look like once it's cut. So the first thing that I want to think about when I'm thinking about how to make this whole thing get taller or shorter is, on this template, it needs to have the type bar move up and down. So I need to find all of the layers containing the stuff that goes on this type line. So I believe they have all of their editable text layers in one folder. So here's the type line, and then they have this frames folder where they have separated the, okay, so here they have in this folder called middle bar, they have all of their type line stuff, and then also the black stroke that goes all the way around. And then text box here, this contains the actual text box. And then borders, I shouldn't need to mess around with. So I may need to do some rearranging of things just to make it so it's easier to modulate up and down, but we'll see how much I end up needing to change this to make it work how I need it to. So since the whole type line needs to move up and down, there's a couple things that I don't actually have to modulate at all to be able to make the text box taller or shorter. So I'm going to mark the layers in red, which I will need to select together to be able to modulate the text box taller or shorter. And a lot of these are already the way that they need to be, and I won't have to do any editing. So here we have the type line, and then it looks like they have an alternate type line for black text. Might as well include that as well. So we'll mark that in red. And then also the rules text will need to move up and down as well. So I'm also going to mark that in red to show me that I need to drag that up and down. I'll include flavor text here as well, because I guess if you want to include flavor text, it would have to move with the rules text. So all of these, if I select all of the ones that I just put in red, these are the ones that will need to move together when I make the text box taller or shorter. Now when it comes to this middle bar layer, all of this is pretty much ready to be moved except for the black line that goes around this, the black stroke, because if I were to move this entire folder, this middle bar folder up and down, the top bar is moving as it's supposed to, but the bottom bar, you see this black line down here, that should not be moving. That needs to stay attached to the bottom of the card no matter what. So we can mark this middle bar folder and middle bar pin lines as red because those are ready to be moved, but this strokes layer is going to need some modification before it can be modulated up and down. The one other layer that's going to need to change is this Textbox folder, but obviously this one also will not be able to just be dragged, because if I drag it down, now it's over the black border at the bottom. If I drag it up, it needs to be able to get longer. So we're going to have to change some things on this one too. Now ideally I would like to have to select and move the least number of layers possible, because if I have to hunt through all these folders and select like 10 different layers to be able to drag them up and down and modulate the frame, then every time that I'm going to adjust the rules text box height, it's gonna take a while to select all the layers that I need. So in the interest of saving time, and the person who made this frame can change this back layer later, but I'm just going to move all of these text layers into the middle bar layer, because I'm going to modify it so that this entire folder will get moved up and down. So the first thing that I want to change to make it so that this entire folder can move, the only thing that's wrong in this folder is the strokes, the black strokes. So I'm going to open this folder and see what they have set up inside of it. Okay, so this inner stroke layer, which goes just around the type bar, is actually all ready to move. We can mark this in red as well to show us that this one can also be moved. So actually the only thing that needs to get adjusted before this entire middle bar folder can be dragged up and down is this outer stroke layer. And the way that I'm going to fix this is actually very, very simple, because the only issue with this is that when I drag it up, the black line on the bottom moves with everything else and it needs to stay where it is. So all I have to do is make a separate layer, which is the black bar that stays at the bottom, and then make one that slides with everything else. So I'm going to Control J, duplicate the layer, and then for this one I'm just going to cut the entire top off of it. So now this layer is just the line around the bottom. And then with the other one, instead of cutting the top out of it, I'm going to put a layer mask. So now you see it only shows on the top, and then this one only shows on the bottom. So I'm going to name my layers just to make sure that they are labeled correctly. So I'm going to label this one bottom, and this one I'll just leave how it is. So now all I have to do is move this bottom one, since this one should not move with the rest of the layers that I'm dragging. I'm just going to move this somewhere else for now so that it doesn't get dragged with the rest of the folder. So now you see when I drag this folder up and down, the black bar is separating. So I'm dragging the top with me, but the bottom is staying at the bottom where it should be. Now my only issue is this gap here. This needs to fill. This black line needs to get longer as I drag it up so that it fills this gap. So I'll move it back to where it was. And what I'm actually going to do first to fix this is unlink this layer mask. What linking or unlinking a layer mask does is, if the layer mask is linked to the layer, then when the layer gets moved, then the layer mask moves with it. But if I have the layer mask unlinked, that means when I click and drag to move the layer somewhere else, the layer mask stays stationary. So I have this layer mask that's making the black stroke only show on the top. It's cutting it off here at the bottom. I'll turn off the bottom layer so you can see what's going on here. So it's cutting it off here at the bottom. Now when I click the chain link to unlink the layer mask, now watch, if I drag this, if I drag it up, here I'll zoom out so you can see. When I drag it up, see the black stroke is actually being dragged upwards, but the bottom edge is staying where the layer mask's edge is. So I can drag this up and the black line stays there. Now I'm just going to have to modify this a little bit, because if I drag it up too far, now the bottom line is within the area of the layer mask, and so I'm going to do a very simple fix. I'm just going to select the layer, cut off the bottom here, so now I just have the sides, and then I'll just select the sides and then just transform and stretch this down. So now I have the lines on the side that go way down, so that I can drag this whole thing up and down, and no matter how high or how low I put it, these black lines on the sides are going to stop right here. And then I have the second layer that's not getting moved. That's just the bottom half. So now my only issue, and this is just because of a stupid mistake that I made earlier, is that when I drag this too far up, the layer mask is actually cutting it off, because the layer mask is only selecting this area. So all I have to do to fix that is just make sure the entire top is in the layer mask as well. So I'm just gonna fill all of this with white on the layer mask as well. So now the layer mask has everything on the top part of this bar selected. And so now this whole thing functions as it needs to, where I can drag it up and down, and it can go as high or as low as it needs to, and the sides are still going to be connected all the way, and the bottom stays stationary. So that's the very simple way of just using layer masks and splitting your thing into two parts that you can make it fully modulatable. So I'm just going to move it back to where it needs to be. And the nice thing about unlinking layer masks is not only can I move the layer independent of the layer mask just by selecting it, but if I grab a folder that that layer is in, when I move the entire folder, the layer mask still stays stationary if it's unlinked. So I'm not having any issues where the layer mask is not going to move. It's always going to be where I just put it. So at this point, now that the bottom part of this is outside of this middle bar folder, if I mark the middle bar folder red, just to show that I have prepared it for being able to be dragged up and down and modulatable, now this entire folder contains things that need to get moved and can get moved without causing any issues. So if I drag up and down, now everything's moving together, and this black bar is not having any issues on the sides of the bottom. So all of these parts are already modulatable correctly. So at this point, the only thing that needs to get messed with is the stuff inside of this text box layer. So the issue with the layers inside of this text box folder is pretty similar to the issue that we had with the black stroke layer that we just fixed, where when you drag it up, it's moving up correctly. It's just that the bottom edge gets screwed up because the bottom edge needs to stay stationary. So in theory, the exact same concept could be applied for this entire text box folder, because the issue here is that it's a set height. And so if I were to drag it upwards or downwards, the top edge is doing what I want it to, but the bottom edge needs to stay stationary always. So there's going to be an issue with doing it the exact same way, but I'll just show you for demonstration purposes. So if I copy the layer, and then I'll use the exact same layer masks that I did before. So for this one, I'll mask it to the top, and then I'll invert the selection and mask this one to the bottom. So now I'll label it so you can see, text box top. So this is the one that needs to move. And now if I unlink the layer mask by clicking that little chain link, and watch, I can grab this with the middle bar folder that we just formatted, and if I drag it down, it's actually going to work to let me completely drag this thing down, and now I can make the whole text box shorter. So watch, if I disable the flavor text thing, now I've got a shorter text box for the rules text. But this is not going to work how you want it to, because even though I just showed you that it is going to put out the correct product, the issue with doing it this way is that when I did it on the black stroke layer, it was just one rasterized layer. So I can drag it up and down and it'll work. But the issue with doing it with this entire Textbox folder is that this stuff needs to change color based on the color of the card. So watch, if I go into my folders and change it, say I need to change it to a red card. I'll go and change the pin line color, change the text box color. See, now you see the issue. Now it'll work and I can drag it up and down and it's gonna work how I want it to, but when I need to change the colors, now I have two folders with all these color options. And so every time I want to change the color of the card, I would have to go into the top folder and change the color, and then also go into the bottom folder and change the color. And I mean, it's a simple method and it works, but I doubt you would want to do that every time you have to change the color of the card. So I'm going to go back and I'll just delete the top text box layer and then delete this layer mask, and now we're back to where we were. So we have to figure out a way that we can modify the height of this without having two separate folders where I have to change the colors in each of them individually, because that's just going to suck. It's going to be a lot of extra work that's not going to be required. So there is an easier way to do this. Well, a more complex way to do this that will require less work every time you want to change the color of the card. And depending on how you structure your template, the solution here is going to be a little different on each different template. So this is really more of a logic puzzle with clipping masks, folders, and layer masks and stuff like that. It's more of just a logic puzzle than it is actual graphic design. So I think I have an idea that's going to work here for this template, but we'll try it out and see how it goes. So the first thing I'm going to tackle is this Pinlines folder, and this one you can see is just the colored line that goes around the text box. So it looks like how the creator of this frame has set it up is they've had all these color layers clipping down to this shape layer, and it looks like for some reason we have a shape and then a layer mask that's clipping it to the same shape. So I think this layer mask is doing nothing. So I believe I can delete that and nothing bad will happen. So the issue again here is that the bottom needs to stay stationary, but the top needs to move. So the first thing that I'm going to do is make a folder here. And then I'm going to clip all of these color layers to the folder. And then I'll move our shape back into the folder. So effectively it's doing the exact same thing that it just was doing, except now we have a folder that everything's clipped to. So I'm going to call this Pinlines clipping mask. Now I'm going to duplicate this text box Pinlines layer, and then I'm going to go grab the exact same layer mask that we just used. And the way I'm copying layer masks is you can just hold Control and click on a layer or a layer mask, and it'll make a selection of whatever shape that layer is in. So I'm going to take the same layer mask that we just used, and I'm going to put a layer mask on this layer. And I'm going to call it Textbox Pinlines Top. And then I'll select that layer mask, Control-Shift-I to invert the selection, and make a mask on the bottom. So now we have the top pin lines and the bottom pin lines. So by doing the same thing that we just did with the black stroke, we can unlink the top one, and now when we grab the layer, we should be able to drag it down, and the bottom is staying stationary, but the top is getting shorter. And then when we drag up, it'll do the same thing until we run out of extra line. So now we'll do the same thing that we did on the previous one, where we just cut the bottom off and then select the bottom parts of these lines on the sides and just stretch it. So now we have a lot more real estate to work with. So basically I can just drag this way up and it's just going to keep getting higher and the bottom is going to stay the same. So I'm going to drag this back down to where it started, and now this is modulatable as well. So now we can mark this layer as red to show us that this is one of the layers that needs to get dragged with everything else. And now I could select this layer with the entire middle bar folder, and when I drag it up, now you see this green line on the side is going all the way up to meet the type bar up here. So now this part is also modulatable correctly. So this method will work, and for explanation purposes it's easier to conceptually explain it doing it the exact same way that I just did the black stroke. But now that we've got it working, there's actually, in theory, an easier way to do this. Because this is not a very complex shape, basically what's getting controlled here is just this bracket that goes on the sides, on the bottom, and back up. Now, I didn't consider this alternate way at first, but sometimes you have to make something one way to figure out an idea of how to do it a different way. So, I am actually going to basically ruin all the work I just did and merge those layers. And we'll just call it Textbox Pinlines. So now the layers are merged again, and I just am back to this shape. And I could have cut all that out of the video since we're basically back to square one, but I figured I'd leave it in just to show that it's part of the process. Sometimes you find ways to do stuff better. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to control click on this layer. So now I have the shape of the layer selected, and I'm going to put that on as a mask. And again, this is kind of ironic because there was a layer mask like this at the start and I deleted it. And maybe the person who created this frame was actually on the way to figuring this out themselves. But regardless, we got here. So what I'm actually going to do now is that I have the shape on the layer mask and I have the shape on the layer itself. I'm actually going to fill the rest of the layer just so that the entire layer is white. So basically we have an entire canvas here of color and it's getting cut down with this layer mask to just the shape that we had previously. Now what I can do is unlink the layer mask, and now if I drag this entire layer down so that the top edge starts cutting it off, you can see that I can modulate how tall this thing is by dragging up and down my layer. So the only restriction is I can make it shorter here, but I can't make it taller yet because I haven't extended my layer mask up. So I'll drag this back up just so that I can see what I'm doing. And then I'll go to my layer mask, select these bars on the sides, and then drag upwards. So now I'm stretching the layer mask up. And so now I can drag up and down this big box, and it will fully allow me to modulate the lines, length, up and down, and the bottom edge is staying where it needs to be. So this is actually very simple and a much more elegant solution than what I came up with before, because it's literally just this big box of white getting masked to the shape that it needs to be. So it's very simple, and I'll drag it back down to match where it should be at the current height. And now actually, since I'm only using one layer, I guess I can just delete this folder and clip everything back to this layer. So I am aware that the template was fairly close to being able to do this before, and that I could have basically achieved this with one fill bucket. But I think going through the whole methodology of applying what we did previously on the strokes and then working from it from there, it will be easier to understand for people who are not as familiar with how layer masks work. So now I can mark this layer as red, just to show myself that this is one of the layers that I have to select to be able to drag everything up and down and modulate the height of the text box. But actually, in theory, we can simplify this more. If we can make it so that we can drag the entire folder up and down instead of just this layer, then we don't have to go hunting through our folders as much to find the correct layers that we need to modulate the height of the text box. So now let's just check what happens if I were to grab this entire folder and drag it up and down. Is it going to work? Now if I select the whole folder and drag it up and down to see what happens, we're actually getting a visual glitch there. Watch, when I zoom in, it corrects. So it looked like we were dragging the whole thing up and that the bottom wasn't staying stationary, but it actually is. It's just, maybe this is just my computer not being able to handle it right now, but see, watch, it's glitched out here, but then when I zoom in, now it's fixed. And sometimes you can fix that by just toggling on and off your layers. So it is actually working. The only issue here is you see the bar at the bottom is white. And that's because when we're moving the whole folder, all of these color layers are also getting dragged up. So our green layer that's clipping down to this shape layer is actually ending here at the bottom. So all we need to do to fix that is I'm going to toggle on all of our color layers, and I'm just going to drag them way down, just so that no matter how high we drag this thing, we're not going to run out of color at the bottom. So then I'll turn everything off but the green again, just so I can see, and this should work correctly. And just a note, because I see this this method that I showed in a previous video utilized here, where we're using the layer mask to achieve a fade from left to right. If you want to do a 2-color card like that, I would just click the chain link icon to unlink this layer mask, just to make sure that this mask is not moving when you move anything else, because you want it to stay aligned to the center and all that. So when I'm using this method to achieve 2 color cards, I always make sure to unlink the masks. That way it just doesn't break when I'm moving stuff around like this. So now this Pinlines folder, I can actually turn the whole folder red to notify to myself that it is actually functional, and I can drag up and down this entire layer and it's going to work correctly after the visual glitch resolves, obviously. This is annoying. I hope that this visual glitch doesn't appear on your guys' screens when you're doing the same thing, because it can be confusing and worrying that you've done something wrong, but nothing wrong has been done here. The reason it's not showing is just it hasn't rendered correctly. So if I disable it and re-enable it, it's fixed. And when you do get visual glitches like that, it is just on your Photoshop screen. If you have one visible and you export a PNG or a JPEG or something, the glitch will not be visible on the exported image. So even if it's appearing on your screen and you can't get it to go away by disabling and enabling, it shouldn't look like that when you export your images. And I don't believe this should be an issue for most people. I'm running on a weak graphics card at the moment because I can't get my hands on a 3060 or anything. So it shouldn't be an issue generally, but it might be a video card or CPU processing issue. Anyway, enough rambling about that. This entire folder is now correctly modulatable, so I can select this Pinlines folder with the middle bar folder, and I can drag it up and see the whole thing is getting longer. We're getting close to the finished product here, and I can make it shorter and it'll work fine. So it's actually getting very close to being correctly operational. The only issue here still is this text box layer needs to get taller and shorter with everything else. So it looks like the way that the artist of this template has made this is just color layers in a folder using a layer mask to clip them down to exactly this shape. And then they've just used a simple bevel and emboss layer style here. Couldn't be simpler. And one thing to consider here is that there is some transparency in play on this element. We have opacity at 80% that can mess with certain ways of doing what we're doing. But I think for the methods that I'm using, the transparency shouldn't be an issue, shouldn't come into play very much. So again, this is just a logic puzzle using layer masks and stuff like that. So currently, what happens if I drag it up and down? The whole thing moves. We've got a layer mask already here. What happens if I just unlink this so that the layer mask doesn't move? And then I drag the whole thing up and down. If I drag it down far enough so that we're seeing the top edge of these color layers, then if I drag the whole folder down a little more, we can actually shorten the frame. And all I had to do there was, since it was already set up as a group with a layer mask on it, I can just unlink the layer mask so that it doesn't get dragged with everything else, and then I can drag everything down, and now I can make the text box taller or shorter. So we'll move it back to where it was for a second, because another thing to consider is that we have some layers here that are, looks like he has darker color modulations and lighter color modulations for if he was using black text. But the darker ones have the color going to all edges of the frame, and the lighter ones are already clipped to the shape that this is getting masked to. And so obviously the top edges are going to be at different heights, and we want to make sure all of these are consistent. So real quick, I'm just going to grab all of these layers, drag them outside of our folder just so I can see them without the layer effects and without the clipping. I'm going to turn them all on. So now I just need to fill everything around these boxes with color so that they're formatted the exact same way as the other ones. And now this is going to be a little weird for these. You can't see it on the white, but there's texture on these. So I'm going to, instead of just using a fill bucket, I'm going to select everything on the outside, and then I will go to Edit, Fill, Content Aware Fill, and this will basically just use AI to fill the empty areas in a smart way where it copies the texture, and so there won't be any weird seams or anything like that. And this is just a way to very quickly get the texture that's on these small boxes and apply them to the entire area here. And just a quick note, you can also content aware fill just using the shortcut Shift F5, I think is the default. That's what I have it set to. I'm pretty sure it's also the default. I'm not sure if the creator of this frame actually intended for these variants of the text box color to be modulatable as well, but just for the sake of thoroughness, I'm going to do this as well. Okay, so now that all of these are extended to the borders, I can turn them all off again and drag them back into the folder where they came from. So now all of our color boxes are exactly the same shape, and so what I should be able to do at this point is just select the folder and then drag everything down to about here, and now it's at the height that it should be. And now all I have to do is make this layer mask a little taller so that I can make the text box taller or shorter, because right now it can only get shorter. So I'm just going to select the top part of it, and then just go to my layer mask and transform, stretch it way up. So now that'll allow me to drag everything up higher and extend the text box up. So now if I select the folder, make sure you have the folder selected and not the layer mask. If I drag it up, now the text box gets taller and it's working how we want it to. So now if I revert it back to where it was, now I will mark this folder in red, again to show that this is one of the things that we need to move. And then Pinlines, this whole folder is good. So now this entire text box folder has been formatted correctly, so we can mark the entire thing as red. So now we have our middle bar folder and our text box folder fully formatted So now if I select both of these and I drag them up, this is the moment of truth, and it's working perfectly. So I can drag it up as high as I want, and the text box looks perfect. And I can drag it down to make it shorter, and it gets shorter correctly. So that is working exactly how I want it to. And just for the sake of convenience, I'm going to put these both in a folder, mark it red, and I'll name it as Textbox drag, I guess, because this is the one that you drag. And so I can make it taller or shorter just by dragging this one folder, which is so convenient. It's a lot better than if I had to go through and hunt in each of these folders to find specific layers. So I've formatted it so that all I have to do is grab this one folder and the whole thing moves how I want it to. And obviously if the frame artist doesn't like how I've organized things, he could drag back these editable text layers and bring them back up to this folder, and just all you would have to do is just make sure that when you're going to make the text box taller or shorter, you need to select all of the layers that I've marked in red here. All of the layers that are currently in this folder need to move to be able to modulate the box up and down. So this ended up working really well. It's actually more efficient than the frame that I just showed you from the previous video series, because on that one I had to go in and hunt for multiple layers and select a couple things, but on this one it's all in one folder. So just to visualize that this is working, I'm going to go in to my middle bar layer, turn off the flavor text, and then I'll drag the whole thing down. So now it is sized perfectly to fit the rules text of this card. And it's working exactly as it should. So that ended up working really well. I didn't have to sacrifice any functionality of the template to make it be able to do this. Let me know if you're having any issues with trying to apply this to your frame, and maybe I can help out. Pop in the Discord and we'll see if I can help you out there. So I hope this taught you some useful tricks to apply to your own Photoshop projects and your own templates. Let me know if you find this more longer form version of tutorial more helpful than the faster time-lapse process that I did in my previous series. I'll have more card design and other stuff coming soon. Update video in the next few days about the future of the channel, what's going to be on here. So stick around, more cool stuff coming soon. Let me know if you have anything that you'd want me to do to improve the videos. I appreciate the support that I've gotten from the Magic Proxy scene, and hopefully you guys stick around to see the other stuff that I'm going to be working on as well, and not just Magic Proxies going in the future. If you're interested in tabletop game design, graphic design, just design in general, stick around. There's going to be some cool stuff coming soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.